Hello, 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 everybody out there in YouTube land. This is Zach Spicer. I am coming at you this month for JT&S. Month of January, we're going to be talking about URD installation, tagging, grounding, troubleshooting, and safety. We're going to go ahead and dive right into it. This is what I've been telling folks is this is just hitting high points. I'll just be honest with you. We're hitting high points here. We're talking about a lot of information in a short amount of time. Of course, getting into this program, we're going to talk about the knowledge needed to recognize these hazards and understand the techniques you need to install URD cable to protect you, the public. Also, the precautions need to be taken out there, and to understand the importance of tagging. Now, when we get to that section, I'll get a little deeper into that, but just know whatever your company policy is, that's what you need to hang with. Of course, we all know before you stick a digger bit in the ground or a ditch witch or a backhoe or anything like that, you need to do your 811 call. Make sure that you got it marked or it's properly marked. Also, I'll put that little snidbit in there. In the U.S. alone, there's more than 20 million miles. 20 million miles of underground utilities. That's over a football field for every man, woman, and child in the U.S. That just tells you right now the way of our business is constantly going underground. Regardless, there's some utilities that any new construction has got to be underground. That's all it is to it. They don't want to see that overhead stuff. They don't want to see those ugly poles, that ugly wire out there. So just know this isn't going away. Of course, here's our colors for 811. I'll be honest with you. I think the only one I have not hit is the purple one. I don't know if we don't have reclaimed water where I come out of, but it's always interesting when you stick that digger bit in the ground or that backhoe in the ground and you see dirt come flying out of there and you're, what do you know? Pressurized dirt. Never seen such a thing. Of course, you hit that gas line. There's always an eddy. There's always an eddy on a cruise somewhere. You always look over at Eddie, and Eddie's always smoking. So you always say, hey, dude, knock that thing out, put it out. Let's slowly back away. Let's call the gas department. You dig those big tree trunks up, but it's a weird looking root because it's got all these multiple colors in there and all that kind of jazz. It's always fun to dig into that fiber. And nowadays, with most electric departments end up actually owning and taking care of the fiber, it's actually going to hurt ourselves. And it's nothing funner than digging in that water line. Of course, now this right here would help you from hitting that kind of stuff, right? Hopefully, y'all have good maps, good drawings, good locators, whole 9 yards out there. Tell you a quick story where I come from. We have a beautiful park called Montgomery Bell State Park here in our utility. And when I worked there, this park was built back in the, 40s or 50s, somewhere in that vicinity. I think 3,300 some odd acres. Beautiful place to visit if you ever get a chance. But come on down and enjoy it. The only thing is if you have power problems, there was like one of a handful of guys you could call that actually knew where this stuff was buried, where these wires went underground, because nobody had maps of this stuff. It is a nightmare when you have no idea, because unlike overhead, of course, you can look up, you can see where the pole is, you can see where the wire goes, where the surfaces are. When it comes to underground, it's just a best guess kind of scenario. That's a big reason why you keep your equipment, cables, info, everything labeled. Everything installed needs to have a label, a name, a location, something like that. Of course, like everything else, regardless overhead, underground, OSHA says it. OSHA says it. And I don't know if I've said this before, but I'll say it again if I have. Anytime I hear shall, when it comes to OSHA, anytime I hear the word shall, it's like I hear Charlton Heston in like the Ten Commandments. It shall be done kind of thing, right? That means the good Lord is saying it, and you got to do it. That's all there is to it, all right? So you need to do a good job brief, communicate all the hazards involved out there to everybody on that job site. Of course, getting into qualified employees and CPR training, I'll tell you a story on myself. First day of work at a utility I used to work at. Like I said, I come out of the Marine Corps, not the brightest crayon in the tool shed. We got to a job site where we were pulling in some underground, popped open a 37.5, I believe, pad mount, and went to pull some underground into it. Well, I'm sort of standing around, the new guy, very first day of work, and I look down at the bottom of that pad mount, and I see a conduit and a rope, and I see our wire sitting here on a twirly bird, is what we call it, or a where to spin off the reel for you. And I put two and two together. I said, I bet that wire is going in that conduit. So I leaned down in that pad mount to grab that rope. Now I worked with a mountain of a man called Harris, big old lineman. And if you've ever grabbed a puppy or a kitten by the scruff of the neck and picked him up, that's what Harris did to me. He just reached down, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, picked me up, set me down, and said, "Don't touch that." I said, "Okay, all right, appreciate it." When the foreman saw what happened, he come over and said, "You realize you're about 6-8 inches away from that 7200 elbow, right?" I said, "No, I had no earthly idea that I was that close to that stinking 7200 elbow." That's why it's such an important deal, or why it's an important thing to have that qualified employee, whether you've been through 6, 7, 8,000 hours of apprenticeship, through union, through a Department of Labor, however it is, you've went through that. And my old mentor, Mr. Bill Eschke, would say, we are professionals, boys. We are professionals out there. So make sure that you are a qualified employee and know how to work around these energized parts. Also, talking about CPR training, this sort of is off on a tangent. I thought it was interesting, so I'm just going to throw it out there. I'd like to ask the question, of course, I'm waiting on everybody to answer. When you hear AED, right? You hear AED. And I asked the question, I said, well, what does AED stand for? Most of the time I hear defibrillator. I hear just a mumble or two for the first two letters, and then I hear defibrillator. About a handful of them actually say it. And I said, okay, well, automatic external defibrillator. Let's go with that. We know what automatic means, yep. We know what external, yeah, I think we could put external together. What about defibrillator? I said, the word that everybody knew, what does that actually mean? Everybody goes, well, it shocks you. Well, yeah, well, why not call it a AES, an automatic external shocker, right? Here's the thing about it. My lovely wife is a nurse lady, and I like knowing knowledge like this just simply based off of I like to be completely useless at everything I do. Defibrillator, when your heart is in a normal sinus rhythm, so it's sitting there, dum dum, dum dum, dum dum, enjoying itself, right, going through the day, until you expose it just a touch to a little bit too much current, right? You get shocked, you get electrocuted, you get hit, and that causes your heart to start quivering. And when it quivers, that medical term is called fibrillation. And so your heart's just quivering, shaking, and of course it's not pumping blood. That's why you put the AED on there, and it says shock advised, because it's actually checking the electrical activity of your heart, and it says, hey, we got to shock this fella. And just like a computer, TV, any kind of electrical piece of equipment you got out there, when you have problems with it, what's the first thing you do? You unplug it, turn it off, turn it on again, right? That's what that AED essentially does to that heart. It goes, oh, let me hit this thing real hard, and hopefully when your heart starts back up, it starts back in its normal rhythm. So it defibrillates your heart. I just thought that was interesting. One of them things off to the side, a tangent kind of thing. But just a piece of information you can stick in your back pocket and tote around. So before you open a pad mount, old Mr. Carl Dudley does our some of our training with our basic transformer and advanced transformer, and he says a thing that's always stuck with me. Use what you got, right? Your eyes, your ears, your nose. When you walk up either to an overhead bank or to a pad mount or anything like that, junction box, listen, look, all that kind of stuff. You know the smell of that burnt transformer oil. You know what I'm saying? You know that smell. You know that 60 hertz hum. If you don't hear that 60 hertz hum, well, you might have an issue. Also, if you get close to it, it's warm, it's physically hot, or it's glowing orange. That just might be a problem. But you might want to back up before you open that door up and actually kill it out, right? So inspect it for damage defects. Of course, wear your rubber gloves, eye protection, FR, all that kind of jazz. And be aware of rodents and animals. When I had started talking about this down south, around Lexington area, I believe I was, a guy said, I'd have took a picture for you. I said, do what? He said, yeah. He said, we just opened up a pad mount. He said it was like plumb full of those fire ants. So I know the further south you are, probably the worse you get it. But those fire ants are an issue. I always find it amusing to find a big burly lineman and you show them a spider and they jump up into somebody else's arms and squeal like a little girl. But be careful, spiders, black widows, all that kind of stuff. Snakes curled up down there, so be wary of those. Of course, you always got to say safety is your first priority out there, right? You want to go home every day. Always cover up primary, secondary, anytime you're pulling wire in or out of an energized pad, all right? Some places I've talked to actually said, hey, we don't do this. We don't pull wire into an underground energized pad. We kill it out to pull anything in. Cool beans. Awesome idea. If y'all can do it, do it. That eliminates that problem, right? This right here just blows my mind, I'll be honest with you. If you look at that picture on the left-hand side there, it's just a hard plastic, what I would say, pole cover kind of thing. And essentially what somebody has done is drilled holes in it, zip tied some magnets to the bottom of it, and now you could just stick it on there. Boom. There you go. Isolate yourself from that primary. A great idea. Why I didn't think of this 10 years ago, I will never know. And it's not a one and done thing, right? You could pop that thing off, set it on top of a CSP or conventional. Works like a champ, man. Works like a champ. Isolates you from that primary. Great idea. Use your cover up, elbow covers, what we call popsicles and all that kind of stuff. Slide them over top of that. Keep a secondary. Keep yourself clear of that secondary. Now, when you have pulling trailers, any kind of equipment like that, got to be barricaded, got to be grounded, anything along those lines if you're working around energized stuff. I will tell you this. This is something I did not know. It's just one of those things that, you preach what the safety manual says and you go on about your business. Well, safety manual says you got three options. You go to the system neutral, or you go to the equipment ground, like the pole ground or the pad ground. Last but not least, you could put in a screw-in ground rod for a temporary ground. I did this little talk when I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a couple guys, and he said, we don't do that. I said, well, OSHA says you can, homie. He goes, well, there was a fella out here setting a pole. Digger truck had a hold of it. They done drilled the hole, set the pole. He was sitting there holding on to it. The guy had done everything right. He pulled that temporary ground off, screwed it in the ground, pulled all his wire off his reel, hooked it up. He was over at the butt of the pole, tamping it up with a hydraulic tamp. Cross arm somehow broke. Gut opened up, something along them lines, and it fell on top of that digger. Oh, well, no big deal, right? You got it grounded out. The problem is, fellas, is if you put a temporary screw-in ground out there, you have no earthly idea how good that ground is. No earthly idea. You don't know how resistive the soil is or anything like that. And just so happened, that fella, and it might be one of the million incidences, but that fella, it really counted to him, when he put it in there, that ground, or that electricity actually said, you know what? No, that's too resistive. The reason why electricity and linemen go together like peas and carrots is because we're both innately lazy. I'll just be honest with you. We're going to try to get away with what we can get away with, right? That electricity went over that ground rod and said, no, this is too hard. It's too much for me to push through this. It backtracked and it went over there to that hydraulic tamp, to them hoses that has that steel braiding in there, and said, you know what, this is a whole lot less resistive path right here, a little easier for me to flow. And it went through that hydraulic hose into that tamp that the fella's holding, and he ends up passing away from it. And like I said, he done everything right. He did exactly what the book said to do. So my caution, my suggestion, my 2 cents, take it for what it's worth. If you got the option, go to your system neutral. All right, go to your system neutral. If not, go to the equipment ground, the pole ground, pad ground, whatever it is. Last but not least, temporary screw-in ground rod. But I would highly suggest try to go to that system neutral right there. For definite that's a good return path. All right, so when you're talking about pulling wire, you need to talk to your cable supplier, Okanite, whoever y'all buy from. Just know there's a maximum pulling tension on this stuff. You got your dynamometers or dynameters out there, and you know how many foot-pounds or kilonewtons you're pulling on this stuff. Minimum bend radius also. It's sort of like fiber almost. When you bend that primary at such an angle, you actually end up starting to degrade the insulation quality of it, as well as you end up you end up causing that primary wire on the inside to be damaged as well, and that messes with the ampacity. The way I like to say it, because I'm just one of them, this is just how I roll in my head. I have to correlate things. Have you ever been on the interstate doing 75 and then all of a sudden it just goes to 35 for no reason? Almost dead stop on the interstate. Well, that's like a domino effect. What ends up happening is somebody 5 miles up the road tapped their brakes, and then the guy behind him tapped his, but he lasted a half second longer. The guy behind him tapped his, but it's a second longer, and then so forth. 5 miles down the road, you're at a 35 mile an hour standstill. Same thing with current. When that current is running through that wire, it doesn't like to slow down like that. And when you bend that wire, that current has to slow down to go around that bend. It doesn't like that. That's why if you've ever seen any videos of having your wire curled up, your ground wire curled up on a reel, and then what happens when you have a fault, that current goes somewhere, and it's liable to go through that wire out into the open world here, right? And it'll explode. So just be wary of that. Also follow any other practice procedures that the cable suppliers recommend. Also make sure you use proper lubrication, either slick 'em, soap, poly water, whatever you want to call it. Actually use it. I know it gets nasty and it collects every piece of dirt known to man, but actually use it. Of course, it's going to lower the friction when you use it, slick 'em and all that kind of jazz. Make sure you set your pulling equipment up on a level surface. Use the appropriate or the correct type of accessories, your pulling blocks, your rollers, and as usual, as this is something I have to say 1.5 times when I teach OSHA and everything else, always inspect your equipment before you use it. Just inspect it. If it's damaged, defective, don't use it, get rid of it, replace it. If any of y'all out there have pulling rigs, that's awesome. A lot of places I visit don't really have those. You might be standing there with the wire held up by the digger truck on a twirly bird or something along them lines, as you have your hip hitting the reel trying to slow it down as you're feeding it off over your shoulder kind of thing, right? Just however y'all could do it, pulling rigs, however y'all set up at your company, make sure that everybody is on the same page and knows how to operate that piece of machinery. Of course, if you're pulling from a location where traffic is involved, signs, cones, flags, anything like that needs to be put out. You need to clean out that conduit. A lot of places I talk to say they allow the contractors, customers to put in the conduit in the ground and they just pull the wire in. That being the case, y'all probably know who the decent contractors are and who the not so decent contractors are. We don't call it a mandrel where I come from. We call it a mouse. But either blow it out or suck that thing through there or something like that. That actually does make a difference. One thing I will say is if you have long runs of wire and you're pulling this stuff through there, you have little rocks and stuff like that, it's going to end up nicking that insulation of that wire. And it's going to nick it and nick it and nick it over and over and over again and damage that insulation of that wire. Hence, now you have spots that you could possibly have some kind of fault. And if you have any kind of rigid metal, anything like that, conduit, if you have water, because I'm telling you right now, I've never seen any conduit without any water in it. It just happens. Especially at the dip poles, takeoff poles, underground poles, whatever you want to call them. Anytime you see stuff like that, you need to make sure that there is no rocks and debris down in there, because when water gets in there and it freezes, it'll physically force those rocks and debris into that cable, like cut into it. So just know that doesn't need to be in there. Make sure you get it cleaned out. Also, your pulling rope, pulling cable, whatever you're using to pull it with, snake, Kellum grip, whatever you want to call it, make sure that it's the right size, as well as the rope you're using. There's nothing funner than rolling up to a job site and seeing yellow rope tied up to the meter base, and then you go over to the dip pole and it's blue and white for some reason. You're like, oh, I don't believe that's the same piece of rope. And when you pull it out of there, you see that there's a what we like to call a hem knot, because only him knows how him tied it. In that knot tie, or in that rope tied in there, right? Mule tape or whatever y'all use, and make sure it can hold it. Of course, put your roller over the conduit that you're pulling. That helps keep it from hitting the edge of the conduit and, of course, skinning any insulation off the conductor. Stay clear of it. If it's under tension, avoid all pinch points, and do not allow the wire to be pulling through the roller itself. That's too much of a bend radius, as well as keep your fingers and hands clear of that kind of stuff. You don't want to get pulled through that roller. Now, when it comes to tagging, I'm just going to start by saying this. However your company says do it, that's the way you need to do it. The best thing I can suggest is everybody at the company do it the same way. All right? Everybody at the company do it the same way. If you have 4 crews and 4 foremans, and each one of them have their own little unique way of doing it, that's only going to hurt everybody else. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when you're going out there trying to figure out where this is, where that is, what do you mean? This guy said it's at the northwest, east-west corner, south-north corner of the dead end. You're like, okay, because you pop that lid open, you read that, but there's no dead end, because you're out there a month or 2 months later, and now that dead end is now become Bluebird Lane. And so you need to make sure the plan for the future when it comes to this stuff. Now, of course, assigning labels and tags, it's got to be maps per the engineer standards. It's got to be proper tagging helps to identify the cable and equipment. And it don't hurt at all to have a secondary tag on there. If you have a small secondary junction box and 4 or 5 houses feeding off, say you got 350 going under the road to feed, 2 or 3 things a 4-0. You know as well as I do, you can't look down there and see those 90s. And if you can see those 90s, they don't point the right way. They never do. Those contractors, when they throw them in there, I don't know how they weave them in there, but it's a pretzel and a half, right? So it doesn't hurt at all to go ahead and label that wire to a different house. And that way that this service run goes to that house, kind of thing. Using colors, cool beans. Red, white, and blue. I've talked to some utilities, said no, white confuses people. They worry about neutral issues. So it's red, black, blue. However your company says it, that's what you need to apply. Also, be wary of getting into to and from, especially if you have loop feeds. If you're not just a radial fed system, if you have loop feeds, to and from can end up getting changed up real fast. It's a good idea to label it, T1, T2, or J1, J2, something along them lines. And that way, if you go source load, this one always goes from T1 to T2. It's not to and from, because if you do to and from and you backfeed it, now the from becomes the to and the to becomes the from. That kind of confusion right there at 2 o'clock in the morning with a guy that's unfamiliar with it can only spell disaster. All right. So make sure everybody's on the same page as far as that goes. Some more pictures of identification there. Now, when it comes to switching, once again, trained personnel, got to have them out there. Also, make sure you identify the cable. It's a really good idea when you pop that elbow off there, you go, oh, what do you know? Those lights went out. But they aren't supposed to. The lights over here were supposed to go out. It's always aggravating when you pull the wrong elbow off, especially for the people sitting in the house, right? And it says use extreme caution when switching multiple phases, right? Make sure you phase this stuff out. When you start putting these things on a parking stand, make sure A is A and B is B. I hate to see a phase-to-phase fault right there in front of you at the end of an 8-foot hot stick, right? Also, use appropriate and approved hotline tools for this stuff. One thing I found at the JT&S school that I had never seen before is if you don't know who I am and how big I am, I'm massive. I'm a mountain of a man. I don't know, about 150 pounds soaking wet, 6 foot tall, so I look like a string bean. And if you're about built like me, to yank one of them elbows off, it has been on there a while. It sometimes doesn't want to come off. It'll suction cup on there, and it does not want to come off. They've got some cool tools out there. It's a hot stick or a shotgun stick with a slide hammer on the end of it. It's amazing. It works amazingly, especially for the scrawnier guys like myself. So whatever tools you have, make sure they're approved, make sure they're tested. When it gets into switching, of course, like I just said about the elbow pulling equipment, Maintain continuity on your concentric. Like I said about Eddie on the crew, right? Eddie always smacked my hands if you didn't leave a drip loop or leave a little curly Q in that wire somewhere. Make sure you have enough on your concentric neutral that you can pull it off, move it, put it on a parking stand, something like that. If you put it just straight to the stinking thing, down there to your 7-strand with a Kearney or a split bolt, whatever you want to call it, whatever you use, make sure you have enough wire to be able to move that thing around. Also, coming to that last point right there, I had an old lineman tell me a long time ago, he said, you can pick up the world, but you can't break it. And I just sort of, I'll be honest with you, I just looked at him like a deer in the headlights because I knew it was something important he was saying, but I had no idea what he was talking about. You only know that when you're up on a pole, I don't know, 40 foot up on a pole, and you're going to pick up a 50 kVA at the end of a shotgun stick, and the boss says, whatever you do, don't miss. And it's one of those things that when electricity is flowing, when it's doing its job, it does not want to turn loose. That's why it's so important to have approved load break elbows, load break switches, anything like that. Make sure that they can break that load, because once you start breaking that arc, or once you try to break it and that arc forms, it does what it wants to do. If it ionizes that air to that elbow and it says, you know what, that's too far a jump, I might jump to the case ground, or I might jump to this phase, or I might jump to the X2 bushing, and it will do that until whatever piece of equipment is backing you up actually knocks it out. So make sure that you have an approved load break device. Like I said, when it comes to switching, make sure everybody's on the same page here. If you have any switch or any circuits that are switched from a normal application, they need to be marked and identified. If you use red, white, purple, orange, striped, whatever color y'all use, do not operate, caution, hold. Make sure everybody knows the policy at your company. All right, make sure everybody's on the same page with this stuff. Now, when it's removed from service, it's got to be tagged before being worked on, both ends of it. That's also a big thing here, to where when you do this, y'all might be out there at the job, you pull an elbow off, you're like, oh, we got an hour and a half to kill right here to knock this job out. We'll heat this back up, and then we'll go on lunch, or we'll go on the next job. Well, when you pull that elbow off and you park it, you get a call, and the pole broke. And so now y'all pack up, and y'all go ahead and change the pole out. Cool beans. We'll come back to this tomorrow. Well, tomorrow it's raining, and then the next day it's raining. Next day you had another pole broke, or you had this or that. It turns into Friday, and then Saturday, Sunday, Monday you come back. You don't go back out there for a week, and you're like, what exactly did we do here? Did we move this over there? Did we move that over here? That's a big reason right there. I can't remember 10 minutes ago, let alone a week ago. Make sure you put these things on there so everybody, not just you, it's not just for your comfort and protection, for everybody. That way, if they send a different crew out there to finish that job up, they know what you have done. All right, so that's a big reason why you need to label it and tag it. Of course, when you're talking about grounding, you got to have a visible opening point, test for voltage, and then install your equipment or install your grounds. That's a big thing. You would hate to try to put grounds on before you test, and just FYI, that probably would not work out well. And if you did do that, you probably only do it one time, and you would never have to worry about that again. So you get your visual open point, you properly test it, and you use your ground conductors or transformers when required. So whatever kind of testing apparatus you have, make sure you use it. Like I tell a bunch of guys, look, you look behind the front seat of the truck, you get all the dip spit bottles and throw them away, and all the Hardee's biscuits wrappers and throw them away. You dig that little case out, you pull it, open it up, make sure the battery's good, and you use that tester. Trust me, they don't give you this stuff just so you could tote it around with you and take up space. They don't give you FR clothes just to make you look good. And I can tell you right now, it don't help some of you. But make sure you use this equipment they give to you. I promise you, there is a reason why you have this equipment. When it comes to grounds, just throwing this out there, the big thing is make sure they cannot be smaller than number 2 AWG. that American wire gauge thing. So it cannot be smaller than number 2, which means a piece of number 6 soft drawn or hard drawn with a couple hotline clamps ain't a ground. All right, that ain't a ground. If that's all you got in a pickle, that's all you got in a pickle. But that's not considered a ground out there. Those smart engineers, those guys that do the jobs that we have to come out and actually undo what they did, kind of thing. No, we love the engineers. I had an engineer department when I worked there. Those engineers do something called an arc fault analysis. They go out there and they look at the impedance of the power transformers and the size of the wire and this right here and the distance and all that, and they formulate and calculate, and they give you the available fault current at spots in your system. And what they do, they take that information and they size your FR clothing to it as far as your calorie rating, and they also use that to size your grounds and stuff. So 2-0, 4-0, whatever you need, they're going to size it to that. But just know it cannot be any smaller than a number 2. Also, with your grounds, make sure they're clean, they're put up, they're hanging up, they're not in the bed of the truck being walked on and oil dry spilt all over. They also have to be have a current test date on them. They need to be tested. A little tag on there says when they were tested, by who, and all that kind of jazz. Of course, once again, rubber gloves shall be used. And I believe the APPA, I haven't seen the 17th edition, but I know the 16th edition says you're supposed to have your rubbers on when you are unlocking and opening pads up. Troubleshooting equipment. Just throwing this out there, a lot of places I go to are a little bit on the smaller side of things. They don't have a lot of underground to begin with, let alone have a lot of underground troubleshooting equipment. So if your company has this kind of stuff, awesome, amazing. Once again, I'll beat that dead horse. The best thing you can do is make sure everybody knows how to use it. Everybody understands it. When you open it up, if it's flashing or it's beeping or it's honking at you, everybody knows what that means. All right, that way somebody doesn't get confused. Oh, well, the light's flashing, that means it's hot, or the light ain't flashing, that means it's hot. Everybody needs to know this. All right, and it helps you to cut down on time as far as troubleshooting this stuff. To where some of the smaller places, you go to the center of that. If you got a radial tap, you go about halfway down and you just pull an elbow and put it on a parking stand and you close the fuse in, and if it blows, guess what? It's that direction. It's back toward the fuse. If it doesn't blow, guess what? It's on the other side of that elbow. And that's a lot of troubleshooting out there. Course points to remember. Here's the high points. Like I said, this is more down and dirty kind of thing this month, because there's a lot of information to cover, and we can cover each one of these little parts about tagging and grounding and testing and troubleshooting. We could cover all those and spend 30 minutes on each one of them easy. So this is just hitting the high points on this stuff. Just need to know that you need to ground every underground cable after testing it. All right. I had said something about, ground every cable. That helps keep that induced voltage off of it and all that kind of stuff. And I had went on, and I'd said that the first couple times doing these meetings. I ended up having one brave guy raise his hand and go, "What do you mean, induced voltage?" He's like, I get static. He said, I know what static is. He said, I've underbuilt underneath 69 kV and 161. He said, I know what static is, but this is underground, man. Like, how do you get static underground? I said, my apologies, sir. I said, I assumed everybody knew what I meant when I was saying this. And that was a big mistake on my part. What happens is this underground wire is built so well and constructed in such a manner with the way the concentric is around the primary and all the insulation involved, that when you put it on when you put it on something and you heat it up, you put 72 or 76 or 14 through that wire, and then just pull that elbow back off and put it on a parking stand, it can retain that voltage. It can hold on to it. It can hold on to 5,000 volts or 500 volts or 100 volts or 1,000 volts. It can hold on to it. Just like a battery, just like a capacitor. And so unless you ground this, it's just going to sit there and wait till somebody make a mistake and somebody gets bit. So make sure you ground it, let alone for just that reason alone. All right. So make sure you do that to get that induced voltage off that capacitance out of that wire. Also, make sure that the cables that you're grounding, if you have two-way feeds, stuff like that, or loop feeds. You pull both ends off, put them on parking stands, make sure they're tested and de-energized on both ends before you put your grounds on. Of course, use your cover-up material, primary, secondary cover-up. And once again, make sure you test and then you ground. Test and ground. Test and ground. And I don't know if I've said this at all, but test and ground. All right, let's see if I can get this video to play here. And just pre-warn you, this is a video. I don't know how the sound's going to be, so it might be loud. So just pre-warn you here. I'll take that back. I don't think there's any sound on there. This is coming from a place like ours. Just be ready. Yeah, if you pay attention to the guy on the left there, he's holding his radio. That's like I said earlier. You find an opening point and then tell him to heat it up. And heat it up. He sticks that radio up to his mouth and goes. And so it right there buttons it up for this month of underground safety, testing, troubleshooting, installing, whole 9 yards. Like I said, hit the high points because this is such a wide range of stuff to talk about here. The big thing I want you to take away from this is make sure that everybody's on the same page. Make sure that if you ground it this way, everybody has the grounds. Everybody knows how to use them. Make sure if you label it, tag it, everybody knows how to label it. Everybody knows how to tag it, knows exactly what that means. I'm going to hit this real briefly. Some places have talked about it. Some places haven't. I know a utility over to our western part of the state had a fatality 4 months ago, I guess now. Well, they've had a couple, but they had... This is my understanding of this, so take it with a grain of salt. This is what I've heard. They had a foreman, mid-50s, 20, 25 years at the electric department there, had an apprentice with him. Their bucket went down. So they had to call an overhead crew in to come out there. They had installed a bunch of underground primary. The overhead crew pulled up on the road, saw the foreman down in the backyard. Foreman stuck his hands up in the air. Foreman was doing that supposedly just to tell them, hey, this is us, this is where we're at, that kind of stuff. But the lineman evidently took it as you stick them hands in the air, maybe the thumbs are up. To that lineman, that means heat it up. That means make it hot. Boomed up, put the riser on, close the cutout in. The foreman and the apprentice didn't see this. I guess the backs were turned or they were walking behind houses. The apprentice, being a good apprentice, he's asking questions. So he asked that foreman, he's like, so on this elbow right here, what's actually hot? Because we've made up a bunch of these, and I don't actually know what this thing is constructed out of. And the foreman, being a good foreman, he reaches down there, grabs that elbow, and he says, this probe. And he touches that probe. And, of course, it's hot, and ends up taking his life. The things we covered in this presentation, we're talking about grounding and tagging and testing and all that. Would that have helped? Well, some guys say, yeah, if I had a ground up there, but this is new construction. So really, do you ground new construction? Most time you only ground it when you're working on it or when you're doing this or when you're doing that. I said, man, it's like I said, company policy. That's a big thing. Know the APPA rules. But putting grounds on it, putting a tag on it, doing something like that. I had a guy say, you know what, though, Zach, I don't necessarily believe that. I don't think that would have actually saved this fella. And I said, why do you think that? He goes, well, if I pull up and I see my foreman down there put his hands up like that, I'm going to boom up and I'm going to take the grounds off. I'm going to take the tag off and I'm going to heat it up because that's what my foreman is saying to do. I said, well, I understand. So regardless of tagging, grounding, testing, any of that good stuff, the biggest thing that you can pick up out of this is going to be communication. Make sure everybody is on the same page. That's like our cardinal sin out there, ain't it, fellas? To possibly pick it up, heat it up on somebody. double, triple, quadruple check this stuff before you go heating these lines up. All right. Greatly appreciate y'all this month. Next month we got bloodborne pathogens coming up. Real fun OSHA updates, right to know, EAP, that kind of stuff. And I know the first week of February, come visit us in Murfreesboro. We've got a JT&S Basic Transformer School. Look forward to seeing some of y'all there. And I believe we have an advanced one coming up in April, I do believe. Yeah, April, I do believe. And then we have March should be NESC updates. So thank y'all for your time today. Hope y'all learned something. If y'all got any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, reach out. Look on the TN JT&S website, and our contact info is on there. So if you got any questions, thoughts, reach out and let us know. Thank you for your time today.